series that is now at its third year. It's a collaboration between PARI, SWAP, GCRO, School of Social Sciences at WITS, and concerned academics. And the idea with this series was really to go through, understand, tackle the various different crises that the city of Joburg is undergoing. When we say crisis, of course, there's like many different meanings, and we think of something that, you know, it's sort of long and it takes a long time. It's something that emerges sort of like out of the blue, or something that is sudden. So we've spoken about water issues, we've spoken about electricity issues, we've spoken about coalition government and the sort of like questions that it brings about. This year, we've particularly focused on civil society organizations and how civil society organizations face and understand the crisis in Johannesburg and what kind of crisis. And we've had really civil society organizations be the protagonists of the series. And we thought that this is a very important moment to now think about what's going on in this, what's been going on in these last couple of months with xenophobia. Obviously, this is not something new. This is not a new crisis. It's something that is there, it exists, but that it reaches peaks at certain points. And so we're very happy to have Dale McKinley, that is going to represent Kopanang Africa Against Xenophobia, talk really about the work that Kopanang is doing. So Kopanang Africa Against Xenophobia is a national coalition of civil society organizations, community activists, migrant-led groups, workers, and individuals who have come together to fight xenophobia, racism, and gender-based violence. It was formed in 2022, and I'm sure Dale will tell us a little bit more about that and all of the work that they're doing. So Dale is an independent writer, researcher, and lecturer, and at the moment, research and education officer at the International Labour Research and Information Group, based in Joburg. He holds a PhD in international political economy and African studies, and is a longtime political activist. I'm sure many of you know Dale. He's the author of several books and has written and researched widely on various aspects of South African and international politics, social and economic issues and struggles. As always in this seminar, about 30, 40 minutes, and then we've got a discussion, or the discussion with a few reflections in technology are at the intersection of transnational urbanism, published widely on international journals, and we're looking forward to the discussion. I think just a few ground rules. As you all know, this is a space in which we would like to have a caring and respectful interaction. So we please bear that in mind when you frame your comments and your questions. Yeah, I think Dale will give you the floor for half an hour, 40 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Federica. I was just noting that quite a lot of people are saying there's connectivity issues. I know that there's been a problem with the internet here this morning, so I'm hoping that those of you who are online can hear. I might then just do away with some of the sharing of screens. I'm more of a traditionalist when it comes to presentations. I don't have PowerPoint presentations and big graphics and other things. I was going to share some documents that sort of give, I think, a bit of content to what I'm going to talk about. And let's see, I'm just going to do that for those that are online as well. Just hold on a second and let's see if we can just pull this up, if it's going to work. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Okay, it works. All right, so I want to start sort of at the beginning here. And I wanted to pull this up here because when right after Kopanang Africa Against Xenophobia was started, we decided to hold a public march. And the JMPD in the city of Joburg banned it immediately. And basically said, no, we can't have it. And they gave all sorts of different excuses, the usual things about safety and security, about double marches, and they didn't have the personnel and everything else, which was all, of course, not particularly reflective of the reality of the situation, to put it mildly. So we went to court. And this has become a key component of not of our choosing. And so, you know, a lot of the critique sometimes of NGOs and others and movements is going to court all the time. But in many cases, we're forced to go to court. And you can see that this was the ruling, the order, basically against the JMPD, the department, the South African Police Services, and basically essentially saying that the applicants, the decision to prohibit the gathering is set aside, the gathering is declared lawful, and they're entitled to do it. Okay? So I just wanted to share that as the starting point, because in some ways, in many ways, that began to frame the entire relationship that we had over the last 4 years with the city of Johannesburg and its various entities, and particularly in this case, the JMPD. And what that told us from the beginning as an organization was that there was an inherent bias. There was whatever the decisions were being taken, or whoever was taking these decisions, and we felt that the order had come from on top. It wasn't ordinary officers at the JMPD that were making this decision. It was a political instruction from those that were, whether that was provincial or local, to basically try to make it very difficult for us, knowing full well that it would probably be overturned anyway. And as I said, this began to frame the kind of relationship that we had, which was a relationship, generally speaking, in terms of local government, provincial government, of contestation, of conflict, of not one of working, of attempting to try to work with us, or attempting to try to listen in any meaningful way. We did not adopt a confrontational attitude at all. In fact, we adopted an attitude of trying to be engaging from the very beginning. And it's important to note that Kopanang Africa Against Xenophobia is a multi-class, multi-political organization. It's a coalition, a campaign. It's not a left political organization. It's not a political party. It's bringing South African communities and migrants together, intellectuals, academics, others, in a space to try to confront the broad challenges of xenophobia. And I'm going to do this sequentially because I think the story is best told sequentially as we move through this. So we're talking about now 2022. I'm not going to go into the history of the entire anti-xenophobia movement prior to that, because it goes all the way back to 2007, 2008, when the first violence began. And there's a whole story behind this leading up to Kopanang's formation and others, but we don't have time to do that. So what I'm going to then move into a situation where what became clear at the time was that, and the reason why Kopanang was formed was because Operation Dudula in particular at that time had formed itself, these groups had formed themselves with the explicit mission of targeting migrants, of trying to basically push a discourse that blamed all the woes that we were experiencing, particularly in Johannesburg, whether it was issues of education, whether it was issues of health, was issues of basic services, whatever it was, crime and security, on migrants. Essentially pushing this. This was, and again, this is nothing new. But what became fairly new and what has defined this period is organized formations. Organized formations that have political connections. This is the difference. In the previous, it was, small-scale shop owners. It was different people that were, having maybe some material interest in getting rid of spaza shops or whatever the case might be. And there's also always been the ethnic element, particularly coming out of KZN, where the hostels in Gauteng have been mobilized. If you look at the nature of the marches and the mobilizations, they're predominantly Zulu-speaking people, predominantly coming out of the hostels. This is not an organic movement. It's not a movement that's coming out of communities. And everywhere that Operation Dula came, we calculated that over the last 3 years, they were never able to pull more than 150 people in any mobilization whatsoever. When March on March came, it was a bit of a different story. So what then happened? Operation Dula, and this is important because it framed our relationship with how we engage with local government. Operation Dula started, and we basically, it wasn't about really, migrants were the vehicle for another agenda, which was to essentially evict people from homes, to harass them, to take over the shops, and to use it as an income generating activity. And this started in Orange Grove in 2022, where over 15 houses of migrants were evicted. Operation Dula took over the houses and rented them out and began to get income of over $500,000 a month. This was a source of income and a source of basically localized mafia. They had already made engagements with the police prior, so that we found that the Norwood police station was in cahoots with Operation Dula. It was receiving, obviously, we couldn't prove this, but bakshish on the side, you know, and we're basically trying to protect them. So again, what we found was, and then we appealed. We made statements. I can share, let me just share another, excuse me, another, sorry, I'm not used to this computer, so I'm just going to, it's going to just take me, okay, there we go. Sorry. Okay, this is probably not going to work very well. Let me see if I can pull this up. I can't see the full name of my documents. Anyway, I want to pull up this one here, that one there. Sorry. Okay, no, that was the prohibition of the march. That was immediately. This was something that we were responding to the JMPD and Johannesburg, and basically indicating that we're not going to be silenced and so forth. Okay, I'm not going to, because I think it's going to waste some time to try to access these documents. So 2022, 2023, the framing becomes very clear to us as Kopanang Africa Against Xenophobia. What's happening is that we now have a new mafia. You have the water tanker mafia. You have the tenderpreneur mafia. You have the housing mafia. You have all these different, and now you have a xenophobia mafia, essentially, which is essentially one that's come out and now is using this as their vehicle and engaging with corrupt officials and people who are either turning a blind eye or not particularly interested in cracking down and implementing the law. And so what do you find? You find a doubling down. The next, I'm just going to go through these things. The next experience that we had is then what happens is institutional targeting of informal traders. And this has happened. We have documented over the last 3 years. If we were to produce this as a research report, I imagine we would probably come up with thousands of case studies of basically every single day, the JMPD and the SAPs descending on the CBD and essentially conducting dragnets. Not to arrest people for supposedly illegal activities, but to shake them down and get money. 2,000 Rand is the going rate. 2,000 to 3,000 Rand, you're put into a van, you're taken to Joburg Central Police Station, you pay your bribe, and you're released. And every single day, God only knows how much money is being made. This has been brought to the authorities, brought to the attention, of course, when they say, file a case. Well, you file a case with the very police who are investigating themselves. It's not going to go anywhere. We know this. We've had meetings with, we picketed at the Joburg Central Station. We had meetings with commanders. We sent provincial commissioners. We sent other things. Very little being done on this. We then also engaged the politicians to try to act on this. But again, there was very little. What then happens, and I'm telling a story that goes through, is that these shakedowns then turn into evictions and to negligence of working with hijacked buildings and then trying to blame those on migrants. So the Usindiso fire and how that was then, that's another big example of when that fire happened and over 70 people were burned to death. And of course, what was the discourse? It's migrants. It's migrants that came in there, even though the count showed that there were more South Africans in that building than there were migrants, actually, South African citizens. So you get the discourse becomes, and then the way in which that is dealt with by the city in terms of finding alternative accommodation, the inquiry that was put, remember the inquiry, the legal inquiry that was then put, that was good. It showed where has been, just like most of our inquiries, where has been the consequence. We haven't seen anyone pay any kind of consequence for what happened. Nobody has been held responsible, not a single individual. Meanwhile, the vast majority of the families were basically abandoned in a tin shack settlement on the backside of Cleveland, over that side, and left to their own devices. While Panyaza Lasufi is having showers in luxury hotels when we don't have water. So that was another example, the way in which the urban space, the spaces where migrants always come, which is in the urban areas in Berea, Hillbrow, CBD, and open businesses as well as live, are targeted, consistently targeted with, but not in the interest of actually implementing the law, but in the interest of gaining extractive value from the migrant community. And this is been the experience. So the Isindiso fire, that's another example. So then what we do is we've realized that all of our efforts to try to engage the authorities, to try to do what our Constitution says, to try to use the spaces, participatory spaces, the kinds of things that we have attempted to do are being closed down to us, or they're just being simply ignored. Nobody's really interested in having a serious engagement, interested in listening to the fact that, these are the experiences of migrants. This is what's actually happening. We need to change tack. So what do? We go back to the legal front, because this remains one of our only tactical options outside of mobilization. But we're not an organization. CAX is a completely voluntary organization. We don't get we don't have huge donor funding. There's not a lot of resources. You can't, pull large people, huge marches together and massive mobilizations, which sometimes people expect to be done. And of course, you're dealing with migrant populations that are scared, that are because if they put their head above the parapet, it's going to get, they're going to face consequences. So you're not dealing with a normal situation where you feel as though your rights are going to be protected. Your rights to speak out, your rights to gather, your rights to do the basic things that most South African citizens would take as not necessarily for granted, but would take as a normal process in our democracy, are not really there in any meaningful way. So we go back. So we start a case in 2023 against Operation Ndula, SAPS, the city of Joburg, provincial government, Minister of Police, all of the whole, basically, in order basically to say, implement the law. In other words, crack down on those who are breaking the law. Operation Ndula is breaking the law. They are taking the law into their own hands. They have become a vigilante group that is basically acting like the state. And they're taking that space, and you're not doing anything about it. In fact, you're encouraging it, or you're turning a blind eye to it. So we put this together in 2023. It took 2 years for that case to be heard. 2 years. It was heard in 2025, Judge Adams. And the judgment was damning. If you read that judgment, it's now cited in many, Kopanang Africa Against Xenophobia versus 2025, versus the city and versus Operation Ndula, and so forth. Without going into the details, what that ruling and judgment basically said was precisely what we had been arguing, that Operation Ndula cannot become the state. It cannot we cannot have a society where people are taking the law into their own hands, that the authorities must implement the law and they must do so equally, that you cannot go, and particularly, and this is why, because of the lack of response, why we have March on March. Because if the message had been sent and Operation Ndula had been shut down, or at least seriously curtailed, in doing what? Going around demanding documentation. You go around and you demand people's documentation. You have no authority to do it. You have no right to do it. And not only that, you weaponize it on social media and in mainstream media. You love the DSTV platform? Well, Zandile Dabula, who is the head of Operation Ndula program, purely completely financed by DSTV multi-choice, put onto mainstream media, onto the platform. She goes around with a crew of thugs harassing migrants and telling them that they're going to hand them over to the police and we're demanding documentation. Completely illegal, which has now become, and this is the second difference between the past. It's mainstream now. It becomes mainstream. This becomes accepted. As accepted, we now shift the goal. Are not implementing the most basic precepts of the law in relation to act. But essentially, they still were emboldened when they tried to, and we'll get to the next one, which is when they started blocking clinics and schools. But outside of that, again, nobody was held responsible. Nobody spent any time in jail. Nobody was fined. Nobody was held responsible for all of these things. Meanwhile, we documented cases. I mean, again, I can't even talk about the number of cases of not just intimidation and threats, but of people losing their homes, losing their businesses, children being denied the right to education, to clinics. And I'll talk about that was the second case, because then they targeted clinics and schools. And this is when March on March came up, by the way. The first action that March on March did in Durban was to blockade Addington Hospital to migrants. So they put a blockade there and said, no migrants can come into Addington Hospital. This is when they started, and that's when they started growing. So they piggybacked on top of Operation Dula's targeting, and they thought that blockading, obviously, children of migrants, in this case, from schools, or blockading pregnant women and others who were seeking medical attention from clinics was going to obviously get them support, because, of course, their narrative, which I'm not going to go into, is basically that because of migrants, South Africans don't have access and not getting the necessary services, and it's draining the budgets and so forth and so on. We know these arguments, all of which are empirically false. And we have a lot of what CACs did during this time. Also, the other side. So we have legal, we have direct action, then we have education and information. So we're constantly trying to contest the misinformation, constantly trying to basically trying to create a social media profile where we respond to all of these, because the other thing, as everybody knows, is that Operation Adula and March on March have weaponized social media. We've had experts with the Center for Analytical Behavior and Change, which has gone into all of the social media accounts, that show that up to 50 to 60% of the posts are from bots and from fake accounts. This is not, and therefore it then appears, and what happens? Media then responds to it. Look at the incredible amount of people that are talking about this, that are supporting Operation, but it's actually not, as we know. And then they pour fuel on this fire, and then people start taking fake news. I would share with you, but they even tried to circulate a poster that put the wrong date on our march to confuse people. So making it appear as though it was coming from Kopanang, and putting the wrong date and gathering points, and putting it out there. So people would go to different places and go to different times. This is how, that's just one example, but obviously other than general misinformation, talking about there being 30 million people of foreign nationals in the country, overwhelming services and so forth and so on. So we did a lot of educational work. And when I say educational work, I mean trying to bring migrants and South African communities together. We held lots of different workshops, gatherings, conversations, other things, trying to build some more cohesive kinds of relations, and to deal with misinformation in a way that wasn't intellectually arrogant or patronizing, but was just basic. We've produced over 20 fact sheets over the last 3 or 4 years of just basic things about, this is the myth, here's the fact. Here's the myth, here's the fact. And of course, this is no answer to the weaponization of social media, because we don't have those, and we refuse to engage in that kind of we could put our own bots out there if we wanted to. We could do exactly the same, but that would then be joining the fray in that context. Where we, with the TAC and Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, Zettenville Clinic, the Department of Health, provincially the city of Joburg, and all the rest of them for not doing anything when the clinics were being blocked in particular, and some schools as well, but in particular the clinics. We got a judgment by Judge Stuart Wilson in last year, which was again damning and went even further, but set the precedent legally that this vigilante activity has to be stopped now, because if it does not get stopped now, we are on a slippery slope. Next, which is exactly what has happened with March on March. It's no longer migrants. It's whether you speak Tswana or Xhosa or Sotho, and you don't speak, and this is what's happening. We have videos of people in KZN and people in the Northwest approaching other people from other provinces saying, you are not allowed here. You cannot work here because you speak a different language and you're not of us. So the ethnic balkanization starts. Then it's linguistic, and we know linguistic. Then it's also racial and color. So you have in Alexandra, and we took testimonies and affidavits from people who were on the receiving end of Operation Adula and March on March people going around and identifying people because they're too black to be South African. They're too black. They're too dark. You cannot be South African because you're too dark. You come from Sudan or you come from another place, and then targeting people on the basis of this. Pure hate speech, pure incitement to violence. The exact things that our Constitution and many pieces of legislation, including the Hate Speech Act and many, prevent. Action? Nothing. Not a single arrest. Not a single person taken to court. We had, let me give you the example of the latest one we just done. It was heard today in the KZN High Court against the mayor of Escort in KZN, who posted on his Facebook page and on his social media that we are going to rid Escort of all migrants. You're going to get out. If you don't, beware, we're coming for you. This is the mayor using his official office as this. And so we took him to the Equality Court, and we have gotten a draft judgment to make him take down all of these things and basically desist from doing these things. But not a single word from many of the authorities, whether that's provincial or national, of course, in this context. So we're talking about very basic kinds of things here in terms of hate speech. The very things that the movement and many of us in this room and many people here fought for and fought against. Right? The freedoms that we fought, and the hate speech, division according to race, according to things. So this is not something about a difference over policy. This is not something about a governance issue. This goes to the core of who we are as a country and the core of not only our law, but our principles and values. So you talk about what kind of crisis this is. This is a crisis of conscience. This is a crisis of political morality. This is not just a crisis of lack of political leadership or of people who want to make money off of others or who peddle in the industry of hate and division for other purposes. This is a fundamental attack on the very basis of the liberation movement and the liberation, what we stood for. That's what it is, in our estimation, in our opinion. Let me give a couple more examples, and then you tell me how much time I have left. Okay, good. I'm just trying to make sure, because there's plenty of things to talk about. And I'm sorry about not being able to share, but I think it would just be a little bit technically difficult given the setup. So the next thing, of course, what happens is, and these are happening over the last 3 or 4 years in our engagement, is the targeting specifically of spaza shops. Remember the thing with the poisoning, what happened in Soweto, and then there were a few other things. And of course, immediately, it's migrants. It's Pakistanis, Somalis, whoever, most spaza shop owners who are getting blamed. They're poisoning our kids. They're trying to take us out. And if you remember, I don't know if any of you saw, there was a circulation that went viral of a particular video that showed, we found out was completely fake and staged, which was of supposedly foreign nationals putting things into, pouring stuff into, and this kind of thing. Like, they're sitting there behind the scenes. Here we are, we're going to take care of these South Africans. We're going to poison them, and we're going to kill them en masse. What happened with the spaza shop thing? What happened with local government and the response to the spaza shop thing? Well, certain politicians, I think, tried to calm the situation a little bit, but institutionally, the response was the township development bill from the province, which was basically saying we need to get migrants more or less. I mean, if you paraphrase if you sort of interpret the bill, it's basically we need to prioritize South Africans. We need to make sure that migrants aren't given priority, and we're going to implement this notion, which of course was absolute legally nonsense, which is that you must have 5 million rand in order to be able to open a business in South Africa. And you must have a business visa, and you must do all of these things. That then raised the issue of documentation, which is at the heart of this crisis as well. So it's a crisis of governance in the sense that this is not a local government issue necessarily, but it is a government issue in its entirety, because it starts with the Department of Home Affairs, which of course has a massive backlog, as everybody knows, of asylum seekers, refugees, and basic visas and work visas and others, and therefore makes people undocumented through no fault of their own. What then happens is they then are confronted in the streets, in their homes, in the buildings, and they're told they're undocumented and they're arrested. They pay a bribe, they get out. Generally is what happens. Nothing gets done. Nobody really gets. And so the local and the national and the provincial meld together in this crisis of this pretense that gets played out as if, you know, migrants are to blame, you're illegal, you've come into this country illegally, we're just checking your documentation. And then, of course, to double up on that, they allow the vigilantes and the xenophobes to do that themselves oftentimes, or at least we have videos of Operation Dudula and March on March people with police officers, with them conducting raids. It's incredible if you think about this, that you have citizens that and basically telling the cops what to do, more or less. If you looked at the March on March gathering in Durban, you found that there was Jacinta and the rest of them in front. There were cops there that were marching with them. They weren't marching to protect. They were marching with them, shaking hands, laughing, yes. And as soon as they attacked migrants, they turned, beating them with shambox. Nothing happens. Nothing happens. So this is the message that gets sent across the board. And when that message gets sent to lower officials and others, well, then we know it's a free-for-all. It's basically you do what you want and nobody really has to pay any price for that. And the Spaza shop thing, in terms of the targeting of migrants, was, I think what came out of this for us was that what we found, and again, here's the difference, you talk about the crisis, is the internalization of xenophobia. In other words, it's almost like this inculcation of an idea and a set of discourses and a set of misinformation and other things that then becomes internalized and becomes the norm. It just gets repeated again in actions, in words, in the ways that we have instances where we had to so we produced a little pamphlet that said, these are your rights, according to what, and this is what the cops must do. And we had to confront police officers themselves and city officials down when they were destroying the spas illegally, by the way, destroying stalls in the CBD, had no absolute right to do that, to show them and say, you are violating. They stopped. And then they came back the next day when nobody was there and did the same thing. So a willful undermining of the very fabric of what governance is all about, and what supposedly, in this case, simply because it involves migrants and those that don't really have a voice. And those who, South Africans and other organizations like CACS, who are there trying to support and create solidarity, are simply trying to cover up. I mean, I was just sharing with Frederica that Jacinta posted yesterday on social media the latest attack. She mentions PARI, LHR, SIRI, Section 27, all these NGOs and movements that are trying to undermine our Constitution by trying to defend migrants. So you see where this is going. Because here's the other thing that we've learned. This is not simply, this is getting back to my original point, that this is a politicized movement. This is about bigger than migrants and bigger than a xenophobic kind of thing, which is that this is about trying to change the Constitution as well. There are political forces that want to go back and rewrite the Constitution. And the very first thing they want to say is the very first paragraph of the Constitution. So instead of saying South Africa belongs to all who live in it, they want to say South Africa belongs to South African citizens. That's the first thing they want to say. And then it goes from there, and taking away all the things. What do you see at the National Department you see them basically retreating from the treaty obligations under the Refugee Act and under this, retreating from international obligations, saying, no, that was a big mistake. We shouldn't. And so therefore, you know, now we're going to board people, the refugee reception centers are going to be put on the borders. We're going to close them all. We're going to make it, you're going to stay in camps. There's no longer a free public because it's overwhelming. The language is incredible. I could give you examples of flooding. Even COSATU issued a statement the other day, which we responded to as COP. and I was sure as CACs, which said we must beware of the flooding of South Africa by foreign nationals and foreign workers, the flooding, as if we're being taken over. And yet our own statistician general, thank you. She basically has said time and time again, and the latest stats, of course, which you can estimate, even if you add on and say it's an undercount, we're talking less than 5% of our entire population at most. So this is the other component. When government officials and when politicians that are elected and are officials that are there to implement the law begin to parrot the very same things, we get what we're getting in South Africa at certain levels, certainly not across the board, but at certain levels, is we're getting a MAGA movement here. And if you want confirmation of that, look no further than what happened yesterday. Jacinta meeting with Cali Creel, AfriForum, and March on March. How's that? Now, not surprising to us, because they both have a similar agenda, which is to divide South Africans according to race, according to nationality, to go back to Bantustans, to go back to ethnic enclaves, to go back to taking care of your own people. And we know where that goes. So in many cases, that has become the story as you get from a situation of targeting migrants to the larger politics. And this then leads me to some of the final comments I want to make in terms of what our experience as CACs, what it says about the general shifting of the developmental approach or the governance approach to what has happened in our country for the last 25 years, which is, in this case, with a migrant population that has grown, yes, and that has created some. And by the way, this is not to say, and CACs has been very specific in case anybody comes back on me and says, but you're not saying 1, 2, 3, 4. We have always said the law must be applied equally, irrespective of who you are. If you engage in criminal activity, it doesn't matter what nationality you are. It doesn't matter. So it's not about protecting crime. It's not about those. There are migrants that are engaged in criminal activities. There are people that have bad agendas. And we know that nationality has no, it's not about who it is. But when you say, for example, when they come, when March on March and Operation just says, all those Nigerians are just drug dealers. That's where it comes. All the Nigerians are drug dealers. All the Zimbabweans are just, such and such, the Malawians or whatever, whoever it is. And then you just paint an entire, just like Trump does, you paint an entire population, you paint an entire nationality as being a criminal. So that's the other is the criminalization of being a migrant. That's what's happened. You're criminalized for being a migrant. That criminalization takes many different forms in many ways, but you're constantly being, so that has crept into the overall governance developmental approach. The second thing, which it has showed us, is that this is not divorced from the generally anti-poor kind of approach, an elitist approach that has been quite apparent in many cases. So look at where most migrants live and look at where most poor people live. They live in the same places, generally speaking. Informal settlements, in places where in the CBD and in the margins, the real margins, the spatial margins of society. You don't find in terms of those. And generally speaking, the issue of what has given rise materially to much of this politics, which is real, is the crisis of delivery, the crisis of basic services, the crisis of employment. All of these things are very real for South Africans as well. So but if you look at it in the larger sense of the term, and where it's the way it's been approached, is that it's not simply an anti-migrant thing. It's basically we don't really care so much about the poor and those who fall through the cracks and those who are on the margins of society, whoever you are, because you're not that important to us in relation to the service delivery challenges. Again, this is not across the board. There are exceptions to this to some extent, but in overall terms, I think we could probably make a very strong argument. Look at Yeovil. I want to use Yeovil as an example. What happened to Yeovil when it became migrant dominant? It got abandoned by the city. It has been abandoned. I don't know if any of you live in Yeovil. I lived in Yeovil for 10 years, and I go to Yeovil regularly. I was just there a few days ago, and I go through Yeovil. It is a sad state of affairs. on every single, the sewage is flowing on every single street. The buildings are in states of, most of them are in states of disrepair, other things. So in other words, what you do is, the other way of punishing migrants is to ignore, and the poor, is to ignore the needs, the basic needs as well, and to make things. And then what you say, then you've got your rationale. Oh, migrants are just dirty. They just create crime. They just create this. So you create the very material conditions that then cause for blame. And then that you can point the finger and say, listen, now we're dealing with this. We're cleaning up. What did the MMC for, what's his name? Joburg, I forget his name, who was down in the, he said, we're cleaning up our city. Yeah, thank you. Zondo. We're cleaning up our city. That language, besides being completely erroneous in the sense of the factual basis of it, is very, very, very dangerous, because that's the starting of the language of extermination. It starts with cleaning up, then it becomes, you are non-human beings, we don't really care for you, and everything. At the Belleville Magistrates Court yesterday in Cape Town, do you remember the Nigerian woman, what's her name, Adesina, who won the beauty contest and then was attacked? There was a court case that was there, and the xenophobes pitched up, and they were in full view of the cops and authorities shambocking people, and nobody was doing a thing, just yesterday. So it's not specific to Joburg or to KZN. It's generally across the board. And this basically creates a situation where you dehumanize an entire section of the population. You dehumanize. So you can do pretty much whatever you want. It's okay. It's all right to do that, because they're really not human beings. They're really not, they don't have, and that's why the constitutional guarantees are so important. Because when you change the Constitution, then legally the protection falls away. All these commitments that we've made and that were part of the 1994 transition and made to be inclusive society, to be a tolerant society. Now, President Ramaphosa says the right words. You heard his speech at the SADC Heads of State Summit the other day in KZN. We apologize, we're sorry, it's an embarrassment that we did these things, and yet they continue every day. And yet there's really not much that is showing about actually, you know, there's a task team, there's supposed to be these kinds of things, but not in a great deal. And certainly at the local level, there's not a great deal, and particularly in our city, where it appears, I believe, to most residents, that the present city council has basically not only gone to sleep at the wheel, but really doesn't care anymore until the next elections. They really don't care. Just doubling down, essentially. That's the feeling. I'm sure that it's obviously more complicated than that, and there's a lot of contestation within the governments, and there's a lot of good people trying to do some things. But in general terms, the feeling of a lot of people, and then you imagine if South Africans are feeling that way, and citizens, even middle-class people, how migrants are feeling themselves about this. So to come and wrap this up in general terms, to get back to the fundamental question that Pari asked about what kind of crisis is this? And I mentioned it's a crisis of conscience. It's a crisis of principle, of what we stand for as a society, of who we are. This is at the core of what the entire identity of South Africa is, post-1994. If we allow this to move in this particular direction and go back to a past that is defined by division according to whatever identities there are, including nationality and racial and otherwise, we are, I mean, I'll leave it. We don't have to talk about what that might mean in the context. It's also a crisis of historical memory. It's a crisis of historical memory. I was on an SABC live debate with the xenophobes about a few months ago. We were ambushed, by the way. We were told there were going to be 9 people from all, and there were 2 of us and 7 people from the Operation Adula and Put South Africa First and everything. It was a live thing. Anyway, one of the things I reminded is to say to Johannesburgers, how was this city built? Where did the wealth of the city come from? From the mines. Who worked in the mines? As well as South Africans. Malawians, Basotho, Zimbabweans, all sorts of other people who came and were recruited. There was no problem with migrants for a long time because there were contributed, and then it becomes weaponized. So there's also a crisis of historical memory. When the way the right wing and the populists gain is they erase memory, they erase history, And then what they do is they take it back to some mythical past, as if before these people came, this is how society was. Let's go back to that. This is what Trump does. Make America great again. What do you mean? Without people of color. That's what he means. In America, let's just get rid of all the people of color, or let's get rid of all these white, and then we'll get back to the white America we had. After we killed all the Native Americans, of course, and others. But here it's the same thing. It's just not said in that way, but it's of some mythical past. When Jacinta, her first words at the march in KZN, that big one where they did have a number of people on the 30th of June, this deadline of theirs, did anybody listen to that speech? Because if you listen to the speech, in the very first part of the speech, she says, "I am glad to see that we are here as a proud Zulu nation." That's what she said. We are here as a proud Zulu nation. So that framing of things gives you indication that, and there's this notion, oh, let's go back to the days of Shaka. Let's go back to the days of, without any historical memory of the fact that the Ndebele people in Zimbabwe came from Chief Mzilikazi, who, of course, and all the people were here within South Africa, south of Limpopo, who were then moved north of Limpopo and established Bulawayo as a result of wars that were going on completely as well. So it's a crisis of historic accountability that I've mentioned, where I would call it a crisis of impunity. We have gotten to a point in our society, and there's no better example than this one, of impunity, where basically if you are well connected enough, if you are powerful enough economically and politically, or if you feel as though you're being protected by those that do have the power, you can pretty much do what you want. And no one's going to come and make you pay for it, or you're going to have any consequence for it. And when we have a crisis of impunity, that is a very, again, a slippery slope in the context of that. So that's the story of Kopanang, where we are and where we've come from, and also what we've dealt with. And I'm trying to weave the story of issues of local government, of crises, and of the nature of these things. There's a lot more that can be said. There's a lot of things we've left out. I'm sorry I wasn't able to share some of the graphics and other things, but I'm hoping that that has provided a frame for an engagement and discussion and a better understanding of where our organizations come from. And let me just end with this to say that when I talk about Kopanang, it's not just Kopanang. There are many other forces and many other progressive forces that are there. We recognize that there are people within the state, there are people within who are trying their best to try to hold the line. And we call it about holding a line, holding a space right now, and trying to basically defend these values. We understand this, and we have tried to reach out and work with as many people as possible. So this is not about politicking. This is not about trying to gain political favor and power or to gain representation at all. However, mark my words, just like Zandile Dubula, who resigned from Operation Dula, you know what she is. She's the candidate for MMC, for Human Settlements, for Action SA, for Gauteng, city of Joburg. And watch what happens with Jacinta. I can almost guarantee you that within a few months, she'll go into a political, probably MK or something else. It's an avenue, it's a vehicle for that. And we're not involved in, we have no special, as CACs and all the generally progressive forces within civil society, I believe, even though we might have our tactical and strategic differences, I think we're all in agreement that what we're defending is, we're defending a struggle, we're defending a value system, we're defending a space that many people fought and died for, and that's worth fighting for. Thank you.
I think we hand over to you, obviously, directly.
Yes. How many minutes do I have?
10-15 minutes.
10-15 minutes. Okay, yeah. Thank you so much, Del, for this very, rich presentation and for all the excellent work that you are doing as Kopanang. It's quite wonderful work that you are doing, and we have learned a lot from the reflections that you have given us, this afternoon. So I'll leave some questions and some points, just to throw in for further discussion. Yes, so I know that you did not want to go deeper into the history of Kopanang in terms of what was there before, who are the members. I would want to learn more about that, to know who the affiliates of Kopanang are, where are they coming from? What is their history in terms of fighting for the rights of migrants and of those who are disadvantaged and so forth? It would be interesting to know, because I know that yeah, you mentioned that there are some migrant organizations that are also affiliates of Kopanang. Yeah, I know that historically, for example, if you look at Johannesburg, we used to have a lot of migrant communities organizing themselves. I hope they still do. The Somali community, they were quite active organizing themselves. The Ethiopian community, even the Zimbabwean community, the Ivorian community, Nigerian, and all that. There's a way in which they organize themselves, and sometimes they also come together. Before, I mean, the African Diaspora Forum used to be very strong. I know that maybe things are not the same anymore, but at least I remember that it was like also an organization that was composed of affiliates,
Yes,
from migrant communities, and so forth, which is quite interesting. And yeah, along with that also, the second question that I would want to ask, in terms of your work, have you perhaps considered the role that the church plays, in terms of processes of healing or even mediating the crisis of xenophobia in one way or another? From my research, I know that there is a lot going on with churches, and some of the churches might be churches maybe led by Nigerians or pastors from other countries, but the membership so often is composed of people from South Africa and several other countries, and there's a sense in which the churches bring people together and somehow bridge the divisions or the gaps that might be there in terms of understanding of each other, or a kind of mutualism that we expect when people find themselves in the same space. That is question number 3. Before I go to the points, let me see if I have another question. Yeah, I think those are the major questions. Now some comments. If I have extra questions, I'll ask. But these are the 2 major questions that I want you to reflect on. So I wanted to just comment, on this particular issue around the kind of commodification of the misery of migrants, and this corruption that you violated of the police, and how that reproduces this crisis in one way, because I mean, when these people, people engaged in xenophobic activities are doing whatever they are doing, their activities, they already know that they have a kind of impunity, because they are working somehow with the police or with the condonment of the police, which is quite problematic, I think. And this commodification of the misery of migrants, or the fact that some of them are not documented, is seen as a kind of cash cow. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what kind of grammar that we can use to explain and analyze this situation. I've used this term of commodification here, but I think there could be, another grammar that we can think of in terms of understanding what is going on, including this corruption or the corruptibility of the police. This is not to paint a picture to say, oh, police are corrupt, but from your narrative, I think this is what is kind of emerging. Then the other point I wanted to highlight relates to perhaps to understand what is going on. I know there's a lot of work that has been done on the history of South Africa, and I remember when you read the historical work of Van Onselen and all those other authors, that Gary Kainok, that are looking at violence in South Africa. There's a sense in which there's a very strong history of violence in South Africa, and to be able to locate what is happening now and understand it, you've got to go back to the history. And there's a profound statement made in one of the readings that South Africa is actually a society that is at war with itself. The pains of the past, to some extent, have not been resolved, and over and over again, you see that repertoires of violence are observable in post-apartheid South Africa. Unlike if you compare with a country like Zimbabwe or Mozambique, where there was a long bush war, where some of those tensions relating to colonialism, apartheid, and so forth, somehow were resolved through the bush war. South Africa did not see, something similar that could have, in some ways, maybe resolved the bush war, resolved the tensions you know, within the society. So I'm just highlighting it as a point. I don't know where we want us to take this, but I mean, it's an observation made a long time ago that probably if South Africa had seen something similar to what we saw in Zimbabwe or in Mozambique, we wouldn't have this normalization of violence or this, culture of violence, and in this particular case, taking the form of xenophobia, but also crime, very high rates of violent crime and all that need to be located within that context. Yeah, if you go to a country like Zimbabwe, it's not easy to even own a gun, or for people to move around with guns, or even to commit acts of violence, because you can easily be, dealt with fast. Yeah, so the people maybe are fed up, or we're fed up with violence because of that protracted guerrilla war. Yeah. So then the other point, now maybe it ties in with what we've been saying. I mean, regarding how, xenophobia is internalized, somehow, imprinted in the psyches of, individuals, even whole communities in South Africa. There's a statement that was made by Francis Nyamjo in his book, in his book Insiders and Outsiders. He makes a claim that xenophobia has become a part of South African public culture. And I think there's something there, again, in terms of understanding what is going on, that if something becomes part of public culture, there's a lot of work to do in order to undo this public culture. Somehow, certain processes of resocializing, communities, individuals, into thinking differently. Maybe the educational interventions that we mentioned, that we are doing as Kopanang, maybe, if this could be a little bit widespread, and maybe this has to be somehow fed into the curriculum. I mean, a bit of more emphasis on history, at school. I remember, I don't know how much history is being done. If it's only the history of South Africa and of Nelson Mandela, perhaps my point is it's not adequate. I mean, if our kids who are going to school are learning that kind of history, it's not adequate. We need to learn a little bit more of African history, so that you understand West Africa, you get an understanding of East Africa, a big understanding, broad understanding of Southern Africa, because I think education really plays a key role in terms of reproducing, ways of thinking and controlling the means of, or influencing the means of symbolic reproduction. My time, I think, is up. And then, okay, I can still go on. Maybe I have 2 or 3 more points left. Yeah, so the other issue that I wanted to highlight, perhaps drawing on the work of the Komarovs, but stretching it a little bit, this idea of the fetishization of the law. I mean, from what you are describing, where people march with police, and except the judges, that seem to have, passed judgments that are very much reasonable from what the observations on the street in terms of the application of the law, or the behavior of law enforcement agents. That is quite problematic. I sense somehow, perhaps if I'm to analyze it, that there's a kind of fetishization of the law, a kind of toying with the law, which is problematic as well for any society. And the points that we made about the Constitution, and that maybe there's a bigger political force somewhere seeking to tweak the Constitution in ways that somehow, disadvantage more and more, migrants or people that are maybe coming from outside of South Africa. I think that is quite critical. And I also see at the same time, this is beyond the Comoros now, the fetishization of the state. I mean, what is happening? I mean, if people begin to take the law into their own hands, make certain pronouncements, and and so forth regarding matters that we, to our understanding, I mean, should be dealt with by the state. If then individuals, groups, even gangs, I mean, I think much this sounded to me more like gangs, begin to make certain pronouncements that are stately. The question is, where are they deriving this power or this authority? Okay, power could be everywhere, but authority. And why is the state not doing anything? Is there no sense in which the state itself in South Africa is being toyed with? I know the state is, has to respect the citizens, but the idea of the state, the government has to respect the citizens. But there's a problem there around this fetishization of the state, even of the government itself and of the law. And then pointed up the next point. I'm now finalizing. The next point is to do with the issue of crisis. And I think you did very well to highlight how, xenophobic violence, and all the problems around it is actually happening in a context where it's connected to other crises that are observable and experienced in South African cities and maybe elsewhere in South Africa. Yeah, that is quite a key point, and I think this augurs very well with this observation made by some authors. I think the key author there was Beveridge on crisis urbanism. That when you are looking at what's happening in the world, not just in Africa, not just in South Africa, but at a global scale, there's a situation that is emerging where crisis is becoming normalized, and rather than talk about urban crisis, which might not be as durable and permanent as what we are observing, we would rather perhaps think in terms of crisis urbanism, which is something that is become entrenched as an aspect of everyday life in our cities, not just African cities, but elsewhere. And the moment we are trying to repair this aspect of the crisis, another crisis emerges and so forth. And therefore, we need to learn how to live with the crisis. And of course, there's a big literature that is emerging on this idea of collapsology. In the current moment, we are seeing a lot of collapse of systems, of institutions, of infrastructures. And the question to ask is, how do we live with collapse? And what processes of repair are possible under situations of collapse, of crisis, and so forth. So that is, another way of thinking. I'm just putting it on the table, on the desk for us to discuss. And this leads us, while we are talking about crisis urbanism and crisis everywhere, we need to think about repair, what processes, where there's collapse, where there's crisis, there's obviously, a reaction of some sort, and there are other processes of repair that must take place, whether we like it or not. Hence, we can think, if we're thinking about cities, a city like Johannesburg, we need to think about what is termed reparative urbanism. How processes of repair, of restoration, of renewal, of healing taking place in the city. We know even in biology that if there's a wound, immediately processes of healing are triggered. So what is also happening in terms of the crisis, the multi-layered crisis that we are faced with? What is happening? Kopanang's work also, I think, is part of that attempt to generate repair, and renewal, healing. Obviously, healing does not mean that the scars disappear, So there will still be evidence that things like this happened, at a particular juncture in the history of Johannesburg or in the history of South Africa. But the point is, a scar, at least, is something that has already been healed. It's a wound that has been healed, although there's a mark. Okay, thank you so much. I'll stop here.
Thanks.
I think we'll give Dale a chance to maybe respond to one or two things, whatever you want to, and then we open up for discussion, and then you'll get also a chance to also respond to some of the things.
Sure. Just let me quickly address the two quick questions in terms of Kopanang's affiliate base. So it's a combination of yes, migrant organizations, including coalitions like CORMSA, like ADF, the Somali Traders Association, others that joined and have been, but we are a loose coalition. So we don't have, it's like a strict sort of organizational membership. It's people that come and go. We have South African communities, mostly from townships and informal settlements. We have NGOs, legal, as well as other CSOs that are supporters, and some of them are affiliates as well. We work very closely with particularly LHR and CIRI, particularly in the inner city, as well on the more legal and advocacy front. And then there is just activists, there's some academics, there's activists and individual people that have along the way joined. And of course, as everybody knows, that since the last few months, what has happened, which is a positive development in our sense, is that what the work that Kopanang did has expanded and moved into other spaces. So other people are beginning to take up different things in different places. And I haven't even talked, for example, and we didn't even have time to talk about the worker issues and migrant workers and the workplace issues, which is a whole nother area We work with the Casual Workers Advice Office here in Germiston, and the stories of what's happened over the last 6 weeks and the exploitation and you know, that whole thing with labor inspectorate. So that's yes, but Kopanang is always in motion. It's moving, it's changing, and of course it's been hit hard also by the fact of what's happened over the last 6 months. Our estimation just in Johannesburg is that, you know, those who have been repatriated, those who have left of their own volition, those who have just gone across the border to seek safety, number to at least almost 250,000 people. But the official statistics tell us that there's 60,000 repatriations. I think that was the latest government statistic. That was mostly Malawians, officially. But a huge amount of people didn't go through the official thing, because what was happening was when you got to Bright Bridge, your passport was being stamped with undesirable, you're not allowed to enter for 5 years. So a lot of people then went around that. And so it has been hard hit in terms of the migrant organizations as well. The role of the church, absolutely. We recognize this from the beginning. It's been a bit of a contradictory role, because we found initially that many of the churches were quite reticent to get involved, at least publicly. We approached the South African Council of Churches, for example, and had meetings with them early on. And there was sympathy, but there wasn't a public, and now they've come forward with the latest humanitarian crisis. Of course, a lot of the Muslim relief agencies have been absolutely incredible. Gift of the Givers, Ashraful Aid, many have the humanitarian side of things, and others. And of course, as you saw, there was a statement not long ago, because police were starting to target mosques. Yeah, they were starting to stand outside of mosques and arrest people and ask them for the documentation. So then the people started getting involved from the Muslim community as well in relation to that. So I think there's also been, and yet, relationship, because in some cases, some of the churches have adopted positions socially and otherwise that some of us would consider fairly reactionary, for example, like gender relations. And others. And so we've had to try to navigate a way through, so that where we're trying to treat everyone equally, irrespective of religious affiliation and otherwise. Just a couple of quick comments, just because I think your comments are standalone. I just want to mention this. I mean, I grew up in Zimbabwe. I'm a migrant myself. And I've been targeted. I just have to share this with you. So during the lead up to the 30th of June thing, one of the Nigeria's leading journalists, Ireti, came here and did a whole series of interviews. She interviewed Jacinta, she interviewed many of us, myself, and had this long history. And when March on March saw the interview with myself and her, and this just shows you how sad and pathetic it was, but it leads into my comment, which is, she said, how is this South Africans? A Nigerian comes to South Africa to interview Zimbabweans about our country. And so that notion of this essentialism of identities, and this goes back to your comment about education. And our experience was when we first started doing our workshops, we showed a map of pre-colonial Africa and a map of post-colonial colonial Africa, and the borders. And when people began to see the borders, the lack of borders, and the borders, and all the lines that were drawn, Limpopo, Northern Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, Mozambique, and beginning to ask, well, who drew these borders? Obviously, the colonialists drew these borders. And therefore, that history of understanding that the divisions were created not by Africans themselves in most cases, but by those who came from that. Isn't that an ironic thing? And when asked March on March, defend these borders, which are creations of the very people they supposedly who came from afar and were not of them. So it's a complete contradiction in terms of that. But I wanted to say that this, in terms of, you're asking that this violence, that somehow there's a society that war with itself. Yes, I mean, look, I mean, we don't have to convince ourselves that the fissures in South Africa go very deep on a whole range of fronts, and that there's huge amounts of work that needs to be done to excavate a lot of those things. But I don't think we believe, and I don't think we subscribe to the notion that somehow South Africans are more violent than other people, or more xenophobic than others, or there's some natural tendency within the society to be this way. So, for example, in Zimbabwe, the country that I was brought up in, the violence is not necessarily individual violence, it's state violence. So you institutionalize violence. So anybody who steps out is smashed. Killed, disappeared, whatever. That creates a message. That's why you don't. Yeah, sure. And, 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 and because, you know, Mozambique, look what happened when people came into the streets 2 years ago. They were gunned down, just gunned down, hundreds. Tanzania, hundreds in Tanzania over a period of 6 months by the state. So that, I think when we talk about violence, we have to put that in a perspective of looking, yes, but it's not to create violent conflict in our society and that they're not resolved in the in any sense of the imagination. Yeah, I think that's what I would just say. I mean, there's a lot of other things to indicate to you. I would, this fetishization of the state, which I would generically place a lot of this xenophobic, because if you could draw clear parallels between what's happening in Europe, what's happening in the United States, what's happening in Argentina, what's happening in South Africa, what's happening. And by the way, let's not forget that after Mujvarabina in Zimbabwe, after the extent, Zimbabwe expelled up to 400,000 Malawians. Zimbabwe did. Sent them back to their own country, mostly farm workers and people that are on there. So these kinds of is not specific to South Africa. It is across, it is indeed across borders as well and experience. Ghana and West Africa also has massive expulsions of Beninese people from Benin, from Cote d'Ivoire, and Sierra Leone, and all the rest of it. So this is not something that is a specific South African.
Do you have the mic? Oh, you give it back to me. Sorry. Okay, thanks. I think let's open up for discussion. If there's questions, comments, please introduce yourself as well. Sorry.
Yes, how far just
Name and who you are, that you come from or
just sorry, we hope that those that are online are not forgotten. Next, Mama. I'm Terence April. I'm a medical doctor by profession. Good. The issue of xenophobia. I think the gentleman here pointed out something that is very fundamental to note, at least for me. Foreign nationals, especially African ones, because there's a lot of white foreign nationals in this country, but let's talk about the African ones. They unfortunately came in a society and amongst people who themselves had serious unresolved problems in their own country with the white population that has been dominating them over the centuries and even beyond 94, by the way. Now, the scarcity of resources, this happens everywhere. I was in Germany in I was there for a long time, but after the wall fell in 1992 or early 90s, Germans, skinheads we called them at that time, they banned Vietnamese. It was shown the whole world over. I was there. I didn't read about it. German citizens around that town were clapping hands. And people were seeing the rise of Hitler and this and that. These things have got to be put into context. Now, the word xenophobia, just for your interest, for me, I only knew it. I left South Africa in 1976. I lived in African countries, several of them, before going to Europe. Now, the word xenophobia, I never knew it until 1996. I did not know the word xenophobia. I know a lot of other phobias. But now, the South African society, as it stands, and some of the things that have happened in the townships. I was born in Orlando East in Soweto. I spent most of my time there too. What we've seen with children who ate poisonous food from the spaza shops, it's not a myth, it's a reality, and not only there, these things happened. The second thing is that when when we want to integrate people, we do that in a manner that is not imposed on those who are staying in a particular place, those who feel that this is their space. Everyone around the world has got that feeling. When a space is yours, you've been born there, you grew up there, you sort of have some form of ownership. Now, whoever comes cannot be the person who sort of destabilizes you. Whether you perceive that or it is real, that's another issue. The problem is the state or the government did not regulate the coming in of foreign nationals into the country. And most of them then went to settle in the townships where there is scarce resources in any way. I wanted to ask one question first. What was the rationale behind the choice of the Sotho or Tswana word Kopanang? Just to take that for me as a clarity. And the second thing is, what do we think should happen in South Africa so that those who have been marginalized, who still continue to be marginalized, don't end up finding avenues like migrants as being their problem, instead to really confront the problems that are there and assist them in their livelihood. This is a scapegoat, definitely. It's not the migrants who are making jobs not to be there. Even if all of them can go back to their countries, we'll still have the problem that we're having. That one is clear. But it is used as a scapegoat, not only here, everywhere in the world. Everyone uses that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's see if there's any other hand, or if you can just keep it short, because we don't have a lot of time. So we've got 1, 2, Lisa, you also, no, okay. 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 If you can just keep it short so that we can.
All right. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Dale, with your presentation. Really, you touched a lot of things. Oh, by the way, my name is Kay. I'm Kay, that's my name. Man, you touched a lot of things here, which also made me think. For example, when you said in some communities, there have been some people who have been forcibly moved out of their premises, their properties. I think I can attest to that. Just 3 weeks ago, it happened that in Malvin, there's a gentleman, there's a retired gentleman, also original from Zim. He was targeted. He used to work for Transnet. So when he retired, he ventured into properties. And then I don't know, maybe there was some issues with the tenants, this and that. But first and foremost, before he was shot dead, was shot 6 bullets, by the way. Before he was shot dead, there were some people who were just coming there, unknown, saying to the tenants, please, you need to vacate this place. There's no, why are you? The owner of the place, we don't have any issues, we're paying rent, he hasn't given us any notice. But they persisted, coming. At the end, they put all his houses, he had about 6 houses. They put all these signs just to say, the property's been bought, property's in. People were worried. And then we said, no, don't leave. You will hear from me. If I'm selling this property here, I'll be the first one to tell you that I'm selling the property. Until the very people confronted him and said, sir, come outside, you want to have a discussion with you. He went outside. They said, sir, we want to see your papers. He said, I've got papers, your property papers. You showed them, but still was shot 6 times. This happened about 3 weeks ago. So I think some of you might have heard about him. He was called Mr. Madondo. I think he's from Zim. All right. So just to cut long story short, there, Okay, I think we are quite all right there to say now, no, this thing now has become dangerous and is so disturbing that the authorities, yes, they are acting, but we haven't seen intangible results on that. To punish people who are now taking this as committing crime against those people. So thanks so much for but the last question now. Sorry, ma'am. Hey, I'm slow talking. Okay. Okay, no, go. These are discussions. Yeah, the last question there, like you mentioned here, what do you think is the agenda behind Jacinta? Because yesterday we saw her, she was having a meeting with the likes of AfriForum leaders, and then some months ago, we remember, yes, South Africa was crying here to saying that the likes of AfriForum, that the very same people went abroad to tarnish South Africa. So what do you think might be the link there? Is there any hidden agenda which we don't know? What's your take? Thank you.
We'll take another question, then you can respond, and in the next round, I've noted the hand.
Yeah, hi, I'm Daniel Scher from Parry. Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I think a couple of points. I mean, I think you've sort of alluded to the fact that, you know, xenophobic leaders and movements are, you know, given more and more oxygen and more kind of presented as holding way more sway than they maybe do actually on the ground. You know, outside of kind of KZN, the marches have often been very small. But there does seem to be a kind of much broader level xenophobia that's shared now amongst a lot of the citizenry. So how do you square those two things? And then maybe just a comment as well. You know, it seems to me that, you know, these movements are very much asserting a kind of exclusive identity, and something that maybe hasn't been done enough is to counter that at the level of a more inclusive identity. And I think that, you know, organizations have a leading role to play in that, in showing the way that I suppose you can relate to one another within a movement. And yes, keen to hear your thoughts on that.
I don't know if there's anybody online.
Yeah, there's one online, but you can respond.
No, there you go. If you want to take more credit, it's fine. Or do you want, it's up to you. Okay. Sure. Okay. Look, I think we could get into a big discussion around the notion of scarcity of resources. In my, and I've done a lot of work on this, I know many people in this room have, in socioeconomic analysis and looking at the last 30, 40 years and everything else. But I think the dominant empirical evidence of the last 25 years in South Africa will show us that there's no scarcity of resources in this country at all. That in fact, the resources are plentiful, that we are a wealthy, wealthy country. The question is the distribution of those resources. And there's no better example than, and that relates to policy and how things turned out in the post-1994 and capital and wealth. The best example of that is to see the parallel growth of informal settlements and poor areas and the growth of Sandton as an alternative city, which is the most concentrated wealth in the entire continent over the last 25 years. And watching this parallel itself. So there's massive amounts of capital, there's massive amounts of wealth. The question is the policy choices about everything from taxation to how we can get into big debates around a whole range of things about the kinds of decisions that have been made about who pays for what and how you distribute resources. So I call it constructed scarcity. You create constructed scarcity for the poor because the poor are not prioritized. The poor are not prioritized. So we had a perfect storm over the last 20 years, massive layoffs and retrenchments because lean and mean, exports are coming in, cheap exports, so a lot of people losing their jobs, no real emphasis on trying to get capital to reinvest in this country, so allowing hundreds of billions of rands to go out of the country to capital to play with on stock markets. I can give you the example of South African breweries. It was a classic example of this, and Glencore was also the classic example of this. So I think that there's a much longer debate here, which is to me about policy choices and about how those things have created a scarcity. And therefore, what you do is then you create a situation where, of course, if you're coming in the country and you have very few resources, just like immigrants in the 1920s, where did they go in Johannesburg when they came from Lithuania, and the Jewish immigrants that came here that were miners? Where did they go? They went into Hillbrow and Berea and those places there. Migrants in New York, in London, everywhere, migrants are going to go to places where it's affordable, where they have some sense of community, where there's other poor people, of course, because it's affordability. They're not going to move into the suburbs. But as a result of that, it creates constructed competition, because you don't then deal with the needs of your own citizens in those contexts. And then other citizens perceive people who are arriving as interlopers, as outsiders, as taking from us. And therefore you create, that serves political purposes. Because when poor people are fighting poor people, the wealthier don't have to worry about anything. They don't have to worry. This is a classic example of the United States, where poor blacks and poor whites were set against each other. And the poor white people then started Ku Klux Klan in order to be able to defend the little space of what they have. March on March and Operation Doodle are examples of modern day examples of a South African version of the same thing, I would argue, in terms of the scarcity of resources. And that would then indicate that, I mean, we can have a debate, and people want to have a debate about what immigration policy. Have you read the white paper on immigration? Now, some people, if you agree with the notion, or this what I call historical revisionism, that all of a sudden South Africa made a huge mistake in 1994 by saying that migrants could come in, and basically live in our society. The argument now is we should have stopped people at the border. They should have made camps and created, and then only allowed those people in that you really want to come in. In other words, scarce. That's a debate that goes beyond this discussion. But let me just say, I think it's very problematic in the context, because that goes to the heart of who we are as a society and inclusivity. There's no empirical evidence at all to show that migrant communities in South Africa have drained this economy in any meaningful way. In fact, it shows the exact opposite, that it's contributed to the economy. The latest South African statistics that I've seen, and I'm not exactly the amounts, but it's billions and billions and billions in the informal economy that's been created, and at least 2 jobs for every migrant business that gets opened. 2 to 3 jobs. There were women marching in KwaZulu-Natal just the other day against March on March, South African citizens saying to March on March, you want to chase migrants away from our factories, we're going to lose our jobs because no South Africans want to take those jobs. So this discourse about if competition over certain things is oftentimes a way of I think, deflecting from the reality of what exists. Kay, your issues of police connivance, Jacinta, what's behind her, I'm not going to get into the conspiracy theories, but let's just put it this way. It's clear to us that there are forces that benefit from what's going on in South Africa. They benefit from it. They benefit from a divided South Africa. They benefit from a South Africa that gets embarrassed on the world stage. South Africa's been taken to the ICC on this issue by a Ghanaian NGO just 2 weeks ago. They filed a case against South Africa at the International Criminal Court for what's been happening. That's huge embarrassment. The reason why we had President Ramaphosa saying his speech the other day is because he realizes that if this continues, the damage done to our diplomatic, trade, and other issues is going to be severe in the long term. So this is not simply about an internal issue. It's also about something that other forces, and I mean, when you have a president of the most powerful military and economic power in the world, basically saying, all white South Africans who are Afrikaners are welcome in our country because you're oppressed. And by the way, Jacinta went to a U.S. democracy program not too long before March on March was formed. So you connect the dots. Connect the dots. I mean, we don't have empirical evidence to show this, but it's clear to me. Connect the dots of the white billionaires and the Stellenbosch mafia and people like Rob Hersoff, who's given millions and hundreds of millions to xenophobic groups, to Action SA, to Patriotic Alliance, to other kinds of things. And then you connect those dots, and then we'll see. And then Daniel, just quickly, the popularity of xenophobes as organized versus the general sentiment and just that in particular. I think what has happened is we're in a phase right now where people have imbibed a certain, not because they fundamentally believe it. And I'm going to give you an example of how that played itself out in practice just now, but not because they fundamentally believe it, but because that's just, it's out of fear, out of desperation, out of everything. And that is episodic. In other words, it's not something that people are going to hold on to as soon as it changes. Let me give you an example. Just outside of Cape Town, in one of the Kailicha, we were sent a video the other day of people who, right after the 30th of June, they went and they trashed 2 or 3 of the spaza shops and ransacked them and closed a couple of other down. The one guy opened up 2 days later, or not, he was trying to open up, but he was still had his shuttered. The same people who had gone to attack him came to plead with him to open their shop because there was no other place to buy anything. So the very same people who embraced the violence and the xenophobic sentiment and everything, just 1 week later had changed their minds for practical purposes and were welcoming and wanting to open the shop. So my point being is that I think where you have organized political, ideological, commitment to an Afrophobic and a xenophobic politics versus people who get out of fear and desperation and mob kind of things, and whoever is doing it, you go with it. Just like we saw in 2021, where, in different contexts where people are going to just join because of certain things. And I think that's the key. And we reject this discourse that the vast majority of South Africans are xenophobic. We don't believe that this is the case at all. In fact, our experience is when you get down to it, yes, there are people who are going to have these, and yes, they're going to have questions, and yes, they're angry, and yes. But after a long period of time of getting to know people, the best antidote to unify is people to see, just like it is on the racial front. You have to integrate our society. If we have spatial segregation, if we allow apartheid spatial things and national spatial, we're going to continue to create the very conditions for people not to know each other. As soon as you don't know each other, you can attack yourself as a foreigner, as a this, as somebody else. You're not like me, you don't look like me, you don't act like me, and therefore it creates those very things. So that's a much longer and much more deeper kind of challenge that we have that I can't address here.
Okay, thanks. So I suggest that we take the question on the chat and the hand online of a comment, but we still, because the hand was up for a long time, and then we take hands in the room for a final round. Yes, I've noted all of them. Just, oh, the hand is back. If we can be just brief and to the point so that we allow everybody to ask their questions. We've got quite a few questions. So please, Tina? Or do you want us to read your comment?
Thank you, Program Director. One thing, I have just written some few points on the chat group, but the point that I need to raise here is that we must be careful about saying South Africans are xenophobic, because on the ground where we are, where we meet different people, there is a lot of dispute around that. But I don't want to dwell too much on that, but instead focus on what I have written on the chat group as a way forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Zain, sorry.
There's no sound coming from the room, but I'm assuming, can I go, Federica? There's no sound coming from the room there. I can't hear anything there. Can I just go? Am I audible? I wouldn't know if you can hear me. Okay, cool. Thanks. No, I just have it's a comment, and hopefully I just want to say thank you, Dale. I think the presentation was able to touch on a lot of some of the issues some of the stuff that we've been speaking about with some of the colleagues and researchers at Perry. The issue around the fact that in a lot of progressive circles, the crisis of anti-immigration is like boiled down to a problem of state building and issues regarding challenges within the state. But what some of the comments that you've made, some of the reflections that you've made, is demonstrating a deeper problem around the question of nation building rather than state capacity. We're busy reading a text at the moment around on a text that discusses the trade-offs that have to happen around nation building and state capacity, where after conflict period or decolonization, there's often this kind of trade-off that one must make. So for instance, where a country will rather choose to do like affirmative action programs within the state to kind of as a nation building program to elevate a previously disadvantaged group. So like in the case in Malaysia, where you had the choice to actually have like affirmative action policies so that they can elevate Malays because they were like cut out of the bureaucracy in favor of the ethnic minority Chinese. So it was a kind of nation building program to do that. Now in the South African case, we kind of chose a nation building program through affirmative action policies, which maybe morally were useful or rather kind of a moral imperative, but kind of the point was that it lacked in terms of in terms of state building, state capacity issues, because you've now opened up the ability for spurious appointments and these kinds of things on the basis of trying to sort out a previously disadvantaged group as a way of building having a nation building project. Basically, the point I'm making is that it seems to me that the choice to go for a nation building project in South Africa rather than a state building project has also been a failure, and it's reflected in this idea of anti-immigration, because things like indigenous language policies have not kind of been put to the fore and try and develop these kind of some of the cultural markers that mark nation building. As you mentioned, some of the things you talked about where language becomes an important thing about questioning people's ability to speak a language. There's a kind of precarity in identity that I think is kind of reflective of this kind of nation building failure, but that's also within a project that was a state building failure as well. Yeah, sorry, that was a bit long. Thanks. Bye.
Okay, thanks, Wasim. Am I audible?
Yes, you are now. Yes.
Okay, thank you. And now we're gonna take another round and then we close. So you have
I asked him how they came to the word.
Yes, okay.
Yes, I'm sure you're gonna answer.
Yeah, I will. Sorry for missing that.
Okay, so these are the question. Okay, so you've got 1, 2, 3. Yeah.
And I think my question was also a bit more comments to add to the complexity of the discussion that we have. The one point I want to make is that the first Home Affairs paper issued by an ANC minister, Motsoaledi, was very scathing of exactly what you said. You must revisit the international conventions. The second white paper that is now coming from a dear minister said,
no, we're not going to revisit any of the conventions. But instead, if you look at that white paper, it is preferring rich migrants. And I think that's important because we need to add that to the debate and the narrative. The second point I want to make, agreeing with, I think, Tina, is that we are scoring own goals, us as progressives, by labeling South Africa as xenophobic. The most we should be saying is there is anti-migrant sentiment. No, because there's a difference between anti-migrant sentiment and even actions and xenophobia. It's like combining misogyny with both bad, but one is a bit, I would say, inappropriate and doesn't reflect an empathetic view. And then the third point I want to make, which is similar to what Wasim was saying, is that the causes of this can also be, this focus on localism. You know, and there's the alignment between the business forums who say you can only take local people. And it is all about, as I think Terry was saying, this issue about how we manage scarce resources. And then my last point, just to add on, I think it's an important debate to say about violence and the intergenerational nature of violence. I mean, I've read literature and intellectual stuff about Zimbabwe, and why Mugabe and his successors can be so violent is because actually there is a strong violent history which goes beyond state violence. But I definitely think that it is a phenomenon also in South Africa. Thanks.
Okay. I think I'm just going to make a comment. And the comment is to say I'm in agreement with the diagnosis that you are making. And it's almost similar to an analysis that was written in a book by Imran Bakas in terms of the forms of movements that are required in South Africa currently. As we have seen globally, there is rise in terms of some form of extremism. And that is why we are seeing the rise of movements such as March and March, mainly because of the vacuum that has been created by some of the political parties that are already existing in parliament. And as you have said, we have seen some of them taking advantage of the fact that the citizens on the ground are already aggravated because the government is not being able to deliver proper services and so on. So my question therefore is, and one comment is that movements such as Kopanang are what is actually needed currently, because I think we need to be able to create some form of unity that would be able to hold ground. And therefore, my question is, since you are saying you are not a political movement currently, which is quite a good thing, what conditions therefore are required in order to maybe visualize a political party that will unite all of us under one political banner, not the GNU like it is.
Oh, okay. Okay, thanks. Dale made a very good presentation, and for myself, I began to get new insights on this campaign by March and March. Well, what I want to raise was, why is our support so little? I mean, I was on the march in Cape Town on 8th August, and I think we got maybe under 1,000 people, and it was mainly professionals. There's hardly any working people or community people. So my feeling is maybe more needs to be done as a low-key educational campaign, because we know that March Against March or the Jula movement are not getting massive support. Or as I mean, I think Lisa correctly said that it's a small anti-migrant sentiment that is being expressed, and it's unlikely for it to build into a general mass fascist movement. So in a sense, you want a low-key ongoing educational campaign, but to draw in organized workers and organized communities. And with the local government election coming in, maybe it's a good time to do that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, on my side, I will just give a few pointers and then conclude. My name is Ronald Chauke. Currently, I'm from a private organization, so I will just leave it there. So quickly, what I want to ask from basically, it will be Barry, to check as to whether is it practical to try to find a way of mobilizing civil society, because the agenda that we're driving is very, very individualistic. And then when you look at our government level, the reason why we're having the crisis of governance, crisis of conscience, crisis of accountability, impunity, is because they need support. They lack the capacity to hold things together. Like, for instance, when you look at the issue of the porous borders, somewhere along the line, people with expertise must provide the necessary support blocks or building blocks to help government to manage that better. And if we do it from, let's say, for instance, far away, by blaming government without providing alternative solutions, unfortunately, the problem will remain. That's where we are, unfortunately. Secondly, I want to check on the issue of the efficacy of the national dialogue. I believe most of you have heard about it. Because in that national dialogue, there has to be a component that talks about migration, building a cohesive, collaborative economy that will be in the benefit of the overall SADC rather than South Africa. It needs to be clarified. So basically, it's also lead us to what we call the vacuum in the leadership. Because if leadership, let's say, for instance, is selfish, is only for one particular interest group of vested interest at the exclusion of the other. Unfortunately, even other people from other countries, when they say South Africa will find greener pastures, they are not made aware that South Africa, unfortunately, is at war with itself because it has a lot of unresolved problems. So those are some of the critical things which in that I can call it a civil society convention, which Pari can say you can try to explore, to engage some of the civil organization leaders to say, can we talk about this guy and honestly, not personal that you want Chauke to be elevated to be the leader above all other leaders, but we look at it from a common ground. I think we can reach a better solution to that. And then in conclusion, to be honest with you, where I'm coming from, I don't see South Africa, I'm a South African born and bred. I don't see South Africans as xenophobic. Unfortunately, the problem is that from a leadership point of view, when the different stages of actually liberating South Africans were being undertaken, there was no proper education about clarifying the stages which we were going through step by step, and especially on the economic front. That lagged a lot, because even now you'll find that most of the unemployed, when they see a foreigner prospering, instead of saying that, let me try to work with this person and then I can gain a skill or so from them, they see them as competitors or as people who have scavenged their opportunities. So we need to educate. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done at civil society level. So basically, I will say, Pari, I hope you will assist. Thank you. Here it is.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to check. I mean, maybe you addressed it, but if you could be a little more explicit. I mean, what is the actual relationship between Operation Dudula and March on March? I mean, if there is, and what are the terms, and what is, you know, if there has been, and then there's, I don't know, yeah. And then I thought it's quite interesting. I mean, this is just a comment or a reflection, doesn't necessarily need a response, but I mean, I think it's extremely important and necessary to look at March on March and Operation Dudula in the global context, because this is something that, I mean, it, you know, the language, the attempt to change the constitution and all of these things, it's something that is, I mean, in Europe, in the United States, as you mentioned, is quite prominent, unfortunately. And I think it's, you know, it's important to sort of like deprovincialize the conversation also with, you know, putting these movements in a global context. And just maybe I'll say a few final remarks after it. But,
I need to leave. Yeah, sorry, I just, okay.
So you're okay.
No, I don't need that, yeah. Yeah, sorry, I do. I'll try my best, and I apologize for not being able to engage everything. Just the Kopanang thing. So at the mass meeting that happened that led to the formation of CAX, there was a big debate about, you know, what do we call it? And we look back, and there was, you know, people, Coalition Against Xenophobia was the previous, just a generic term. But people felt at the time, the majority of people, and that's why it was chosen, because it was a majority opinion of those that were at that initial mass meeting, was that we needed to join a South African identity with an African identity. So Kopanang being from linguistic family of South Africa in the suit of coming together, unifying, and Africa, Kopanang Africa Against Xenophobia. So the whole purpose of Kopanang is to bring South African and migrant communities together. But noting, and that's why we use, and we haven't used this, but Afrophobia, which of course is the dominant lived reality, as you mentioned, in terms of, it is not that people, march on, when Jacinta was asked, why aren't you marching on Santon and marching on, or all the other, wealthy, it's because obviously those who have money, and this of course goes to the whole issue of borders, because we get into a whole nother debate, is that what capitalist neoliberalism has done over the last 30 years is it's globalized capital and deglobalized humanity. So what is it's done is its borders have no meaning for capital anymore, but they have more meaning for human beings than ever before. So we adopt a completely contradictory position. Oftentimes people demand that borders be secure. From who? Poor people, mostly. Rich people, not a problem. You can cross anywhere you want. You can go anywhere you want. You can do anything you want, anywhere. So there's a whole range of other components here about class and global power relations that have to do with whether or not securing borders will do anything. It's never going to stop anything. You can build the wall that Trump has built between Mexico. Does it stop migration? No. You can put militarized like Europe has done. Does it stop? No. Your debate in terms of borders, but the issue I'm hearing everybody is speaking. I'm not going to engage. I agree with a lot of the comments, and we have made it clear as Kopanang that we don't believe that the majority of South Africans are xenophobic. And we've made a case as to why that's the case, and it's a lot of constructed dissentiment versus a belief, and that's why we have targeted those that are organized. We've gone after the political and organized forces that have weaponized this. We haven't gone after the ordinary person. We haven't gone after people who have done things because they're in fear, or because they've been taken advantage of, or because they've lacked the knowledge necessarily maybe to make the connections between what migrants bring and what the realities of their own poverty and inequality are. So I think that's crucial, and I agree with all of those. I think we agree with all of those things. The comments on nation building are well taken in terms of that, and the elitist nature oftentimes of the way in which BEE and affirmative action has taken place, where it has not filtered down in many cases to the, and it has privileged political position and political connection over people's capacity to do something. So often, but in many cases, the bringing army, we're a single one in deployment of the entire city, the richest city in the continent and in the world. Now that would tell you something about the kind of deployments that are being made in the state, and why the capacity and the inability to deliver and do the basics are affecting predominantly mostly poor communities. I'm not going to get into the debate about political parties and movements. That's a longer debate. What is needed? Let's just put it this way. I think we could all agree that what is absolutely required right now is for people of conscience, for people who believe in a more inclusive society, who believe in a Pan-Africanism, who are committed to breaking down those barriers and everything wherever we are, whether we're here or somewhere else. To redouble our efforts on every single case, whether that's within civil society organizations, which we're trying. But let's be clear, we're also facing, as a result of this right wing, a massive squeeze on resources. Everybody's feeling it. You know how much, just to give you an indication for those of you who've never been involved in trying to pull a march together, and Gulam's making, pull a march. To pull a march in Joburg, central city, to bring people from the townships and to bring people from where they are, because spatial geography has created distance. And many of the migrants were too scared to come out on the streets, by the way. Some of them were quite a lot of people, which is understandable in many cases. So just to practically bring people here, to make a march of, let's say, 10,000 people would cost almost $500,000. Just to do that in transport alone. and for everything else. We don't have those resources. Civil society doesn't have those kinds of resources. And we have no public transportation of any to speak of. We don't have, Argentina can pull 1 million people on the streets of Buenos Aires because there's about 5 million people that live within a 10 square kilometer area in the city. It's integrated, whereas we are divided. So apartheid also prevents us from pulling ourselves together, the legacies of apartheid. I just wanted to mention that. But I absolutely, without being rose-colored glasses, without trying to be naive about things, our work is cut out for us on a whole range of fronts. We need to wage an intellectual battle. We need to wage a practical battle. We need to wage an organizational political battle. And we need to do so in a context where we're on the defensive. Let's be honest. Progressives are on the defensive. We are trying to hold lines. We're trying to hold spaces. The right wing is moving all across the world. They have the resource. The billionaires are funding. Imagine if we had our own billionaires. I mean, it would be, it would of course be a contradictions in terms, but I'm just trying to imagine that, you're talking about these things. So we are on the defensive, but I believe fundamentally that we're going through a period where we will come out on the other side more united, more organized, more everything, precisely because the alternatives, and by the way, there's many alternatives out there. There's economic alternatives. There's things that have been offered. The question is, can we create the social and political power to push those alternatives? It's not a question of a lack of alternatives. They're there. They're there. It's a question of whether or not we have that power. And that's our collective challenge. It's not an easy one, but it's one that I would say that we all should be part of wherever we are. And instead of, as one person in my community chat said, we can moan a lot and we can create and criticize, which we should, but unless, the old worker saying, organize or die. Yeah, organize or starve and organize or die. Well, if you starve, you die. So yeah. So yes, thank you.
Thank you. Just 30 seconds if you need.
You sorted it.
Okay, that's fine. So
And thanks again. Thanks to Perry and everybody else. Appreciate it.
This online and it will be available to everybody. Is everybody okay with that? Yeah. Okay, perfect. So thanks very much. Thanks to everybody in the room and online. Thanks to Dale and Obvious. And I think you gave us quite interesting sort of like input for reflection also on what crisis is and how we actually think and conceptualize it. Yeah. Which was very good. Thank you very much. And yeah, we'll be out.
Thanks, Obvious.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we didn't even touch, we still didn't touch.